Dan, welcome to the Decision Making Studio podcast. This is a pleasure. This is going to be a lot of fun. This is the highlight of my day, so welcome.
Yeah. Oh, thank you very much for inviting me.
So first of all, congratulations on the Unaccountability Machine. A fabulous book. I loved it. It explains so much. So really a fabulous piece of work. Congratulations. We'll get into it. I wanted, before we do that, I know we spoke a few years ago about your previous book, Lying for Money, but for my listeners who may not know of you or your work, it would be great to just maybe start with a bit of a background to who you are and what you do and all of that good stuff.
Sure. I mean, basically, I think these days I can safely call myself a former investment banker. I used to be an equity analyst, and specifically an analyst of bank regulatory capital, back when that was quite a profitable niche because it was the financial crisis and there was a load of things going on there. Before that, I spent a few years working for the Bank of England in the UK, but really since 2014-15, I decided that investment banking was more of a young man's game. And since then, I've been doing research, writing books, doing bits of consultancy, working with a global outsourcing firm called Frontline Analyst, and just generally living the life. But I've become increasingly interested in systems, general systems thinking, and specifically something called management cybernetics, which is a wonderful piece of old 70s nostalgia, where they tried to apply information theory to problems of decision making and control.
Okay, fantastic. And so I think that leads us nicely into the book. And what I'd love to start with the origins of it and what led you to writing it and what led you to discovering management cybernetics.
Well, this kind of goes back to the previous book that we talked about a couple of years back, because I'd originally been interested in financial crime and fraud. And that's the thing that always interested me about that, is that it's just one of the blind spots of economics, that there isn't much to say about fraud from a standard economic paradigm, because your standard model of economics is about perfect information. And obviously fraud is all about imperfect information that's actually been adversarially constructed. And so I started kind of looking around to think, well, is there anything, any branch of science that has actually tried to deal with problems of information in a less restricted way than economics does, which led me into the management science literature. But then at the same time, I got very interested in some of the 2008 financial crisis stories, where, famously 2008 to 2010 was the crisis that was nobody's fault. One of the big reasons why it's the subject of so much popular rage is that no bankers went to jail. And if you look back to it, the reason that no bankers went to jail is that no one actually sat down and committed a crime, in the way that the legal system demands someone to have done before you can put them into prison. There was no single controlling intelligence of these organizations. It was, what I call in the book, a self-organizing control fraud. And then, after spending a bit of time after the publication of that book talking with people like yourself, I just got more interested in what is it for a self-organizing control fraud? Is there a general thing there that lots of organizations make decisions, including, in my view, some very bad decisions, which have no individual human being as their owner? And once you start looking down that alley, you find a lot of interesting old things, because back in the early days of the modern giant corporation, like in the 1950s, 1960s, just when these things were going from kind of single product companies to big multi-dimensional structures, people were very worried about these big organizations. People recognized that this was a very new thing. And then just over time, we seem to have kind of forgotten to remember that big organizations are actually very weird things that as a species, we human beings don't have very much experience of.
And we can every day see and feel this, right? When we're trying to complain about something and you can't speak to a human being and you get, menus of options and things like that.
Well, you get menus and options, and then, you feel like you've hacked the system when you get through to a human being.
Yeah.
But then when you get through to a human being, 9 times out of 10, you got through to someone who is themselves working from a script which has limited numbers of options in it, because that organization has just built up a specific set of arrangements in order to stop it from having to talk to you and treat you as an individual case, because dealing with everything as an individual case is just, someone has decided not an efficient way for them to process their information and make their decisions.
Anyone who has worked in a large organization, I have a lot of listeners who have, and I have, and you have, the behavior in the managerial class, if you like, is one of avoiding accountability. And so anyone who's been in a large organization knows these meetings where you have to invite a bunch of people, and it seems like the purpose of these meetings is to diffuse accountability for anything.
Yeah, although when we put it that way, it kind of sounds like it's a really bad thing that these managers are doing, because in our daily life, when you deal with someone who's trying to avoid accountability, you usually know that that is a sign that you're dealing with a wrong 'un, because in general, the people who kind of try to avoid having their names attached to their decisions are usually doing it for bad reasons. In organizations, I think it's kind of almost more interesting, because the reason that people kind of hold these meetings and draft policies and do anything to avoid being identified with their decisions is that they don't feel like they're making those decisions kind of subjectively. So it's almost like, maybe 200 years ago, if you had a plate and a knife and fork on your table, those would have been made by an individual craftsman or craftsperson. Someone would have been able to point to them and say, I made that specific item. These days, those are, in general, unless you're very, very rich, they are the outputs of an industrial cutlery making machine. And so the operator of that machine is not going to pick up your knife and fork and say, I made this. And kind of what's happened in big organizations is that they've grown so complicated that individuals can't really kind of hold the structure in their head. And so you've developed these organizational structures which just basically amount to an industrial decision-making machine. And so if you're a manager, you very rarely feel like you're a person making decisions about things. A lot of the time you feel like you're the operator of a massive decision-making machine. And if you don't feel like you made that decision, there's no way that you're going to want to feel like you're accountable for it. That's just really, really psychologically intolerable.
It's just normal human behavior to not want to have that accountability, because you could get fired for not operating the machinery in the way that you've been instructed to operate it, as opposed to use your own judgment.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. If anyone who works in a big organization knows that the worst thing in the world is having a cost appear on your budget that you're accountable for, but it's a cost that's not under your control. That's, I would say, a solid quarter of all really bad workplace situations are caused by people being held accountable for things that they can't actually change.
You have a wonderful term called accountability sink. And I'm going to be using that a fair bit now. But wondering if you could explain what an accountability sink is and what happens with it.
I mean, the paradigmatic example of the accountability sink is the kind of strange social convention of a gate attendant at an airport, where someone kind of is given responsibility for telling people that they're bumped from the flight or they've been downgraded, and but they've got no ability to change that decision. It's purely kind of the implementation of a policy, and you can't get in touch with the person who could change that. And so by kind of employing the gate attendants kind of as a human shield, the airline has created this really strange situation whereby you have to talk to it like a human being like yourself, but it speaks back to you with the voice of a completely impersonal organization. And what it's done there is it's created a broken feedback loop. So it's kind of created, something that looks like a two-way communication channel that people would be expected to interact with, but one half of it has been effectively broken. And, I call this the accountability sink because it's just the name for these broken feedback links. It's a place where unwanted negative feedback or unwanted kind of unpleasant emotion and accountability can just be diverted into the sink where it dissipates without ever affecting anything in the organization. And obviously, when you put it that way, you think, breaking a feedback link, does that sound like a good piece of engineering? Probably isn't. Will that inevitably end up with bad decision making and some disastrous consequences of some sort sooner or later? Probably will. But in the short term, it solves the problem for the manager. It solves the problem of them not being able to deal with that feedback by cutting out the feedback and pretending that it doesn't exist. There's this kind of great quote from one of the original kind of writers on management cybernetics, a guy called Stafford Beer, where he points out that ignorance is the information processing system of last resort. That's, once kind of an old boss of mine used to say to me, stupidity is an affliction, but ignorance is a strategy. And it's the same kind of thing.
So you mentioned Stafford Beer, and his work, and I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of an introduction to him and his two, I guess, seminal works: The Brain of the Firm, The Heart of Enterprise. And he's not a gentleman that I've heard very much of. And so, how did you discover him, and who was he? And
he was recommended to me by two people, one of whom was just a former kind of colleague who had been a management consultant in the 1970s when Stafford Beer was just ubiquitous, kind of, he's one of these management gurus that comes and goes and then is forgotten by the next generation. The other person who recommended it to me was a guy who's quite big in the world of ambient music, because Stafford Beer, to the extent that his works survive these days, they survive through his most famous kind of disciple, who was Brian Eno. And Brian Eno recommended Brain of the Firm in particular to a lot of other people, to the extent that David Bowie was still listing it on his top 10 favorite books in interviews into the 1990s. To be honest, both of those books are tricky for me to recommend. They are out of print in the USA, in print in the UK only in academic editions, which cost far too much. And they are quite heavy and mathematical, because there's a lot of kind of Claude Shannon's information theory that just has to be built up in order to kind of justify the things that they're saying. If I was going to start anywhere with Stafford Beer, it would be a book called Designing Freedom, which is a summary of some lectures he gave on Canadian television. And in fact, under that title, the lectures themselves, I think, are still available on YouTube. And it's worth looking at the YouTube because then you really get a picture of the man. Because he was pretty much literally a hippie management consultant. He used to kind of have the full kind of flowing guru beard. He was into yoga. He was into, it was the period when being into technology was a very kind of hippie coded thing to do. And, but lots of serious mathematicians and physicists took him seriously. He used to talk to Norbert Wiener, who was one of the more important mathematicians kind of the wartime and post-war era on an equal basis. He corresponded with Claude Shannon. He was kind of there with corresponding at the time of the invention of the neural network. And, this guy was a serious mathematician who turned his attention to management and decision-making in organizations, which was really kind of interesting because once you get to very, very complex systems, you kind of know that the laws of information theory have to hold, but you can't measure the amount of information that's going on. It's in the same way that in physics, you know that the same laws of physics have to apply to all of the atoms in an ideal gas, but you can no longer hope to calculate the individual atomic interactions. You have to start kind of thinking about the ideal gas as a different kind of object. And so you get to this kind of stage in management theory where, as my friend Ben Recht from Berkeley University says, maths becomes metaphor. Rather than trying to measure information flows in kind of megabits per second, you start having to think about them in a different way and say, are we providing this decision-making node, this individual manager, with more information than they can process? How do we, if that is the case, how do we bring the node back into balance in terms of, their ability to manage their information flow? Do we do it by adding more resource and adding more technology to the processing system? Or do we do it by reorganizing the information flows to reduce the input? And you can kind of say things like that. And what interests me is that actually, Stafford Beer and the cyberneticians appealed to me because they're mathematical. But really, if you look at management science in general, I would argue that pretty much every management theory and management science book that's worth the paper it's written on is dealing with this same problem, because it is the central problem of management, which is of getting a drink from a fire hose, of taking all of the information that you could possibly take in and deciding what you're going to throw away, what you're going to pay attention to, and how you are going to convert information into decisions. Because that's what management is. Management is basically an information processing task.
There's a lot there, and I'm trying. I read particularly your fifth chapter where you say you introduced it saying this is heavy stuff.
Hellish to write.
Yeah.
I can promise you it was more difficult to write than it was to read. Absolutely.
But I'm just sort of I'm trying to wrap my head around what you're saying and also relate it to my own experience. And so we've got all this info, and there's way more information now than in the 70s that a manager or decision maker needs to grapple with, or if they are genuinely grappling with it, which is they're probably not. But so in a way, you're not saying this idea of an accountability sink is always a bad thing. There are lots of things where we need to we need to rely on a system,
Yep.
but we also, if
Yep.
I'm getting this right, we also need to understand where that system is fallible, and where you talk about this thing of, you call it it's called variety engineering. So it's when there's just too much external pressure on the system, so we need to intervene and we need to understand how it can fail. And so I'm just wondering if we could go into that a little bit, just to try to understand what we're tackling with, and where and how decisions ought to get made. I think that would be a good place to spend some time.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, variety engineering is, it's absolutely, it's kind of at the heart of the book and of the decision-making system that kind of we're talking about here. Variety is just really kind of information considered in the context of decision-making in a very big system. So, you can call it information. I often do. If you say variety, then you're going to be less tempted to try and measure it in megabytes per second or whatever. But really, variety is just look out, what's the environment throwing at you, or what are your information inputs throwing at you? Because obviously, unless you are right kind of at the operational level of an organization, your environment is not the environment. Your environment is made up of the reports that someone else has chosen to form your information environment. But fundamental kind of theorem of variety engineering is just simply the principle of requisite variety. You have to, at every point in the system, ensure that if someone is trying to manage something, if someone is trying to kind of regulate their part of the system, they have to have at least as much variety as the inputs or their information environment. You can, rather than being kind of theoretical, just, imagine in your mind or think back to a time in your own life when you had more information coming in that you could handle, and think back to a time in your own life when things were under control and your mental model of your system was adequate to that. That's just the difference. So what the kind of mathematics tells you is that every decision-making node is going to bring itself back into balance. Information and capability, variety and environmental variety and managerial variety are going to balance, just like supply and demand are going to balance. It's just that, as with supply and demand, the way that they get brought back into balance might or might not be something you don't like. So people bring themselves back into balance either by calling on more capabilities from elsewhere in the organization, or by throwing away some pieces of information and not using them. Or, as you say, in many cases, by building systems. An extremely efficient way to amplify your own variety and your own decision-making capability is to manage by exception. If you set up a policy and say, everything will be decided by the policy, I will deal with the exceptions, then, suddenly, depending on, how your information environment is structured, you could be cutting down 90% of the decisions that you would have to make. Because often it's only ever 10% of the cases that actually require your effort. So, and that's a great thing to do. That's basically how we manage to create big organizations and how we create the industrial world today. The problem arises because the other big theorem is, it's what they call the Ashby-Conant good regulator theorem, but that is only worthwhile for anyone planning on looking it up on Wikipedia. It's just simply the principle that anything which is regulating a system implicitly contains a model of that system. So your rule book implicitly has a model of the system that it's trying to regulate. That model, the system will be well regulated if that model is a basically accurate representation of the system that it's trying to control.
Right.
When the model drifts, the system becomes more difficult to control.
Right.
Consequently, because the model always will drift, anytime you set up a system like this, you also need to budget for the capability to monitor whether the model is getting less relevant and to change the system, when it has drifted away from reality. If you don't do that, then what you've created is an accountability sink.
Right. Okay. So I want to link it back to a couple things. I'm not sure if it's entirely entirely right, but imagine, so if you have a policy, or you're managing a thing, you have a policy, all of a sudden you're getting there's exceptions, and all of a sudden you're getting lots of exceptions. So clearly something's wrong. The policy's not working anymore. So it might be someone grappling with, try take an example of you're a teacher and you're a school administrator, and all of a sudden students are using AI to write papers, and you're like, oh crap, like we've not dealt with this before. We have to change the policy, we have to change the thing. But if I'm not empowered to do that, if I don't know how to do that, then we've got a problem.
Yeah, exactly. You need to be able to call on more resources. Mm-hmm. And that's why people who build organizations and systems build them hierarchically. Mm-hmm. So, you might, the dirt simplest idea of kind of example of this idea is that I kind of have my go-to example of a rule book that is also a model is a sign on the wall in a shop saying no refunds, no exceptions. That's a model of the circumstances in which a customer might ask for a refund. And it's got a clear way of regulating customers who come in saying, asking for a refund. But it's a model that can lose touch with reality. So say the consumer law in your state changes, and now you aren't allowed to refuse refunds in some situations. At that point, the sign no longer works. It's no longer handling any of the cases. Everything becomes an exception that the store manager has to deal with. Mm-hmm. The way that you deal with that in an organization is that the store manager passes that problem to a higher level of management, to the regional manager, who then either has to provide more capability for customer service to deal with the higher number of their refund claims, or has to kind of design a better sign that says, like, refunds only allowed within 30 days of purchase, or refunds only with receipt. The idea here is that for the area manager, they've now they're one step up. They're dealing with management from exception, but they're dealing with the exceptions to the exceptions. Mm-hmm. So they are kind of hoping that all of the subsystems they're responsible for won't all start reporting a problem at the same time and overload them. And if they do that, they have to pass it, even further up the system. So these models are always embedded within other models. Everyone is part of someone else's information environment. Everyone is responsible for controlling a subsystem that's below them. And I don't want to get too hung up on above and below as hierarchical terms, because often you can get the same person occupying very different roles in different decision-making systems. And that's the way that you kind of organize these things. You have these kind of complicated networks that, when they work well, work by transferring the capability to match spikes in the variety and volatility of the environment. And when they don't, they act as accountability sinks that kind of the higher level just gets to cut the lower level loose, pretend that it's not got any problem, and let everything drift and get worse until the problem becomes so big that it can't be ignored.
So this is it's fascinating. And I want to bring in the role of, so the topic that you mentioned in the book, that whenever I see the term financial accounting in a document, it's sort of my internal sleeping gas mechanism seems to, sort of go off, because it seems, rather boring and arcane. But actually, it's almost the opposite. It's almost, maybe even that's sort of by design, but, that if you're, if you're making these decisions, if you're a manager and an executive, you need to exercise judgment. You need to be able to understand the trade-offs. You need to be able to know what's happening in the organization and why. And frankly, that's why I would have thought we pay these people large sums of money, because these are difficult things to, but, if you're actually, so this concept of, so I want to just talk about this concept of financial accounting versus managerial accounting, and why that's important. And I'll try and describe it based on my understanding from the book, but then you can sort of correct me that we create numbers and accounts around any organization to help us understand what's going on. But we've got it in reverse because of this thing called financial accounting, which is to satisfy shareholders. And we're trying to make decisions based on what the number. So we're trying to manage a business based on managing the numbers, rather than using numbers as feedback to understand what's happening in the organization. And this fundamental thing about financial versus managerial accounting. I'm not sure if I got that right, but I'm sure you can explain this and why it's so important, why it matters.
No, it's absolutely. Actually, one other kind of fun project I took on while almost kind of overlapping with writing the Unaccountability Machine is that I was writing a book jointly with a guy called Will Butler Adams, who is the chief executive of Brompton Bicycles, which is the kind of premium folding bike company. And it's a great little company. And, we were kind of discussing how they had managed it and how they'd kind of had to get past their founder syndrome and scale up. And one of the things Will said really stuck in my mind, which is that understanding the numbers has to come from understanding the business.
Yes.
If you try to do it the other way round, you will always run into problems. And it's because the numbers are a model of the business. So the internal accounts are always, a model. They're a simplification of the actual activities and transactions that have happened. And different people can make different assumptions. So regularly, I know that this happened at Brompton Bikes because I ended up writing about it. When they reorganized the factory from a craft production basis to a production line, it was actually surprisingly difficult to tell whether that had reduced costs or not, because everything depended on how much you allocated, where you allocated the overhead, where you allocated the cost of inventories, where you allocated the cost of space. And it was regularly the case that different managers could produce a set of spreadsheets and accounts with wildly different representations of what had happened in numerical form. And so these were arguments about the business being carried out in the form of numbers. But the trouble comes when you get the numbers taking more kind of prominence in the decision-making process than the actual physical facts of what's happening. Because the numbers are always a compromise. They're always a kind of messy representation of what's going on. And that's particularly the case with financial reports that are produced for investors or which are produced for the market, because that's a purpose that you can pretty much guarantee is going to be it's based on generally accepted accounting principles, which means it's based on standardized assumptions across, the entirety of corporate America, Europe, and Asia, which means that these assumptions will not be appropriate for any particular individual company. They are okay on average, but you're not actually trying to manage the average organization. You're trying to manage one specific organization. When I do kind of training with accountants, which I sometimes do, I always say that there is one number in every set of accounts, which is almost always a lie. And it's the biggest lie in the accounts, and it's on every page of the accounts. And that lie is the date at the top. Because when you present a set of accounts saying 2024 fiscal year, you are implicitly telling the reader of the accounts that 12 months is the relevant period for assessing the performance of that company, which is going to be true only by purest chance. And if you were to say, why 12 months? Why not 5 years? Why not 3 months? Why not 1 week? Then the answer to that is going to be dependent on the specifics of that company. It's very handy for investors to have everything standardized to 1 year divided into 4 quarters. But, that's just kind of one example of, financial numbers making loads of implicit modeling assumptions that people don't even necessarily understand are assumptions. It's not even that they're ever kind of questioned. And that compares to management accounting, which used to be, in the early days of accounts, people would regularly commission accountants to just come up with a set of process efficiency numbers for a given process. And they weren't comparable to anything else. They couldn't be added up to give an aggregate divisional or organizational performance metric, but they didn't need to be. They were numbers for that process that helped you understand that process. But if you take a set of financial accounts that weren't designed around your specific production process and try to use them as your main tool of information about that process, you will absolutely infallibly confuse yourself. And, now I think that's kind of a large part of the story of what's gone wrong in some parts of the corporate world over the last 10 or 20 years.
Now, wouldn't others argue that we need these consistent, generally accepted accounting principles to combat things like fraud, that you've looked at? These are invaluable, invaluable practices.
They're useful. At the end of the day, they are useful to investors. This is the only way that someone who has got to invest in, the S&P 500, which contains 500 different companies, you can't become a specialist in the individual production processes of 500 companies. No one's brain is that big enough. You have to devise reports for that purpose. However, in terms of control on fraud, I've always joked that accounting fraud comes in 2 kinds. One kind that you have to hide from the auditors, and one kind that the auditors will help you with. And right. The financial accounts are very necessary for finance, and finance is a big and important part of the economy. It put bread on my table for 15 years, so I'm not going to say anything bad about finance. But the danger comes when you mistake a very important part of the system for the whole of the system. In particular, I think a big problem arises when a company takes on a lot of debt. If we think about this, just back in all of this is based in information theory and what kind of information is going into the decision-making process. When you have an entirely equity-funded company, and let's say it's entirely kind of bootstrapped, there's no outside investors, the founder of that company has basically total freedom to make decisions. They have to kind of respect fundamental physical and economic reality, but otherwise they can do what they want. Take in some outside investors, now you've got another priority that you have to pay attention to. You don't have full decision-making freedom. Take on some debt, and now your control relationship with that organization has fundamentally changed. You have to pay attention to the financial accounts because you have to generate enough cash every month, quarter, or payment date to make the interest payments and roll over the debt. So you now have an additional constraint that you have to pay attention to. When a company is very indebted, that becomes a signal that swamps all other sources of information. A very indebted company cannot pay attention to anything other than things which are relevant to making the next payment on the debt. And again, I think a big part of the story of the last 20 or 30 years since the leveraged buyout boom, the leveraged buyout boom was in its early days explicitly disciplinary. The idea was very much, kind of in the barbarians at the gates and KKR era, that companies had got soft and flabby. Management were pursuing much too much kind of self-dealing, country club memberships, private jets, long lunches, no-show jobs for family members, all the kind of, abuses of a company left to its own, and that loading them up with debt would cause them to pay attention to the bottom line a lot more. And, that might even have been true. I was barely a teenager in the 1980s, so I can't say whether it was true or not. When you get to the stage at which you've got private equity shops taking over, decent, profitable industrial corporations, leveraging them up, taking out kind of the dividend, and then leaving the thing unable to invest and gradually picked apart by international competition, I think you start having to ask yourself, is that debt actually leading to good management decisions, or has that debt actually become something which swamps the information environment and just pollutes the decision-making across the entire organization?
Right. And I want to bring in a few other things here from your book, because ultimately good decision making is about managing trade-offs and not optimizing for a single objective in an almost ideological fashion, which is what it seems like we've gotten ourselves into. And you mentioned the term polycrisis in the book, and so systems break down. I guess, is this so without the ability to do this variety engineering, without the ability to to attenuate the system and make these judgments, then they break down. And
absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, kind of, we were talking earlier about kind of my toy example of the retail shop and how each level of the system kind of manages by exception and absorbs some of, provides excess capability to the level below, absorbs some information for the level above. And those kind of hierarchical systems are how we protect kind of our overall decision-making systems from kind of the volatility, of the world. The trouble is that if we spent a long time hollowing out those decision-making structures. Again, maybe back in the 1970s, there was a huge amount of deadwood and bureaucracy in corporations and in governments, but it feels like it went too far. We ended up not just getting rid of excess bureaucracy, but getting rid of vitally needed state capacity. We ended up getting rid not just of deadwood management, but of vitally needed planning and kind of crisis management capability. And we just created this system that was intrinsically fragile because there weren't those middle layers to absorb variety. there was just the operations and top command. And then we loaded up with debt to make it even more fragile. And so the higher levels just coped, in the way that we were talking about earlier. They coped with the inability to kind of handle their variety, handle their feedback by breaking feedback links and creating accountability sinks. They coped by making policies, algorithms, rules, systems, kind of other kind of euphemisms for something which contains a model, but without budgeting for the resource to monitor and update that model. And things went along looking really fine for the first decade, roughly for the first short decade of the 21st century. And then, small nominal fall in US house prices and all hell broke loose. And those shocks have been just bouncing around the world ever since. It started with CDOs, but by the time you've had something kind of go from subprime mortgages in Las Vegas to bringing down the government of Greece to kind of, introducing kind of populist governments all over the world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You start thinking, those kind of people mis-selling investment property mortgages to strippers in Las Vegas isn't a big enough cause to have had all of these consequences all over the world. There must have been something wrong with the overall system that these shocks kept on cascading through it. One thing that really always interested me is that if you look at the recovery from the pandemic and compare that to the recovery from the collapse of Lehman Brothers, just kind of thinking off the top of your head, you would say, well, the pandemic was a massive physical disruption to everyone's life. It actually killed quite a lot of people who would otherwise have been contributing to the economy. That would surely be something that did really permanent damage to the output of the economy. Then you'd look at Lehman Brothers and say, it kind of sucked. A lot of people lost some money, but nobody died. No physical capital was destroyed. We ought to be able to bounce back quickly from that. And yet if you look at the kind of the economic record, we recovered really quickly from the pandemic. We recovered really slowly from Lehman Brothers. And I think what that's telling us is that one of these things was a shock to the control system. It was effectively a piece of damage to the brain of the industrialized world, whereas the pandemic, was something that the control system and the brain of the industrial world was able to respond to pretty quickly. It was just a flash wound.
And you talk about, so we're optimizing for this shareholder value thing, and even when you think about that, and I think you have a sentence in there that we're optimizing for almost an average shareholder, because shareholders are all of different, they have different time horizons, objectives, and everything. But somehow we all assume that they're all really interested in quarterly reports and quarterly performance. So we're optimizing everything for that, and not able to do this, variety engineering.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's absolutely notorious. It's kind of a sort of proverb almost among analysts and investors. Anytime you look at a company that really cares what its investors think and spends a load of time and effort on has a big investor relations department and is always going around asking people what it should be doing, you've got a company that's going to have bad share performance. You know that if your chief executive is spending half of his time in Stamford, Connecticut, asking 25-year-old business school graduates what he should be doing or what she should be doing with a global industrial company, that company is on the way out. Have a look at the investor relations department of Apple sometime. It's tiny. And the reason is that they've got their own strategy. They know what they're doing. The investor relations department there just literally exists to set up a time to hold a conference call to tell them how well it went.
Right.
And I think that's exactly what you're talking about here. It's there is the investor here in kind of the shareholder in shareholder value is just not an actual thing. It's just kind of a purely ideological construct that's meant to kind of occupy the position that the Holy Trinity does. It's something that you just kind of turn your face toward and hope that you will be blessed.
You have a wonderful quote in, I think, an interview from the FT in which you said something to the effect of, it's almost like having your investor relations department manage your company. You're managing you're managing a company through the investor relations department, which is just is madness.
It's madness, but it happens.
Yeah.
I have seen it definitely happen that, serious decisions, involving like thousands of people losing their jobs have happened because some CEO didn't want people to get mad at them on the next conference call. And when you kind of, when you kind of think of that happening, that something has gone badly wrong with the decision-making architecture at that company.
I just had a conversation with an author, John Morrison, who wrote a book called The Just Transition, which is all about climate transition and just making a transition to a to a net zero world, sort of just for workers and for society, basically. And so I've read your book and his book in short succession, and the parallels of something are really stark in that he has quite a go at the ESG movement and also to the way in which sustainability is kind of moved into compliance. And then what went off in my head, the dot that I joined was this thing about financial accounting, because all of this stuff now is attached to financial accounting.
God, isn't it? Yeah.
And I'm like, this is madness, because we need to be able to make judgments rather than now managing. So we're managing a set of metrics to deal with what's going on in the planet. And we're missing the point, it seems to me.
No, I got quite I will admit that I got quite excited about ESG when it was kind of first came out. I was kind of quite close to some of the people in the accountancy world developing environmental reporting standards, and kind of God bless those guys, and they're trying and they're doing hard work. But I think I ended up with the same kind of reaction as you have, which is it not say something absolutely dreadful about our society? Does it not sound kind of insane that we're faced with something that we all know is a threat to life on Earth, and the only way that we can think of to address it is to develop an accounting standard? It's just you kind of, if it's not taking the problem seriously in the way that it demands to be taken seriously, to start saying that the only way that we can address this is by developing a set of reports that can be distributed alongside the financial accounts. No, I totally agree with you.
It's almost doing at a larger scale what we've been doing with organizations around not really understanding the organizations by looking at trying to understand how the numbers tell us something about what's happening in the organization, rather than managing an organization via the numbers, because there are so many, the ES and the G, that they're actually, they're not mutually exclusive. You can't say, something that has a climate impact could have an impact on water, which has an impact on, societies, which then has an impact on governance and, populism. And so it's really hard to disentangle these things.
ESG scores are, the bane of my life, because you take all of these things and you compile them down into one single score, for
Mm-hmm.
environmental, social, and governance. So it's like, all right, if you cut down your carbon emissions, you might be allowed a bit of racism, but only if you kind of have short-term limits on your directors. And it's just trying to do the kind of things that worked a bit for financial investors without going back to the central problem of management that I keep banging on about, which is what information is there out in the world, and how can you bring that into a form in which it can reasonably be the basis for making decisions. And if you started addressing the problems from that kind of starting point, well, you would come up with something that does not look at all like modern ESG reporting standards.
Yes. I do want to transition into some of the ways forward, some of the solutions, and things that I know you have a few recommendations about leverage buyouts and things like things of that nature. But you do reference a few things that have been suggested in the past. I think something from Paul Volcker, if I'm not mistaken. But what are some of the things that we could start to think about to recognize, and deal with accountability sinks in this problem of the unaccountability machine?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm always kind of embarrassed about trying to get into these kinds of discussions. It's always the thing with kind of books of this kind that you spend like 300 pages talking about a massive problem through all of society, and then 30 pages in which you go, no need to worry, I've solved it. And I kind of try not to do that because I'm always worried about being mistaken for the ordinary kind of megalomaniac. But as you say, I personally think that there's not much point in tackling other problems with our decision-making architecture if we are going to continue with financial debt being used as much as it is now, because debt is in its own way a great information technology. It's a great way to invest in 500 companies, because you only need to make the decision, are they going to pay the money back or not? So it's a great way to mobilize the savings of the middle class. And the fact that the United States of America worked that out earlier than most of the rest of the world is a big reason why the United States of America is the most successful economy in the world. But you can have too much of a good thing. And my view is that the amount of debt leverage we have in the economy is just not consistent with any functional decision-making architecture. There are just too many things that are being managed by the need to make payments and to roll over financial debt. For that reason, I think that we would need to reform things in ways that I don't see as being consistent with the continued existence of the private equity industry in anything like the form and scale that it currently exists and operates. Venture capital is different. Venture capitalists have their own pathologies, and they have their own effects on the decision-making processes of firms, but they're not as dependent on being able to, on debt leverage as the buyout firms. Beyond that, I find it difficult to say too much. When I'm doing consulting, and people kind of ask, how do we do a cybernetic analysis? In general, my advice is, this is not a good way of getting repeat business, by the way, but in general, my advice is, if you want to do a cybernetic analysis, do the same analysis that you were doing anyway, but keep it in your mind that the information balance sheet has to balance. And so when you see something that is an accountability sink, what you're looking at there is a symptom. So, it's not usually a good idea to just say, we need to get rid of this because it's a broken feedback link. You need to kind of start doing kind of 5 whys analysis and going back to why was that accountability sink created, almost always it's because some level of decision making was overloaded, and this was kind of a temporary solution to someone's problem of not being able to manage the variety and volatility that they had to handle. And then you go back to kind of to the source of the problem, and you have to say, you know, is the issue here that we need to reorganize so that this kind of decision-making responsibility is pushed down to a lower level of the organization and the overloaded part can manage by exception? Is it something where this is a problem that needs to be dealt with at a higher level of the organization? Or, you know, and this is probably the most exciting thing right now, is this a problem where we can just use technology to expand the capacity of that node? You know, because, you know, there's a great book by a guy called Alfred Chandler, which is kind of worth knowing about because it's one of the only management science books that's respectable in economics faculties, because it was written by an economic historian. And, you know, Chandler's history of corporate America is a history of information technologies. You know, what he says is that ever since the railroads, things have grown. As they grow, they get more complicated, you know, which is just simple mathematics. You know, the complexity of a network grows roughly multiplicatively. The capacity to manage the network has tended to grow sublinearly. So it's grown less than linear because managers get in each other's way and create communication problems for one another. As a result, from time to time, you know, the gap between complexity and capacity to manage it becomes unbearable, and businesses reorganize. Now, and they always reorganize in the direction of devolution because they're always trying to move decisions down to closer to the environment so that the top management have their information environments kind of managed and attenuated and can manage by exception. And so you have deconglomeration, the multi-divisional company, kind of all of these sorts of things. But in between times, you know, that kind of linear, sublinear expansion of capacity gets affected by discontinuous jumps with the invention of new technologies. So the railroads were made possible by the telegraph to a huge extent. The railroads were also made possible by the filing cabinet. You know, the filing cabinet was an information technology back in its day. When you have big advances in computing power and technology, you know, that's an information technology. Decision making and management is an information processing task. Information technology revolutions ought to be accompanied by revolutions in management. You know, it's a really kind of interesting and depressing fact that the introduction of the PC and of the mainframe computer didn't actually have much effect on the structure of most corporations, because it was politically difficult to install computers and reorganize to take the benefits of them. So everyone just used them to speed up the payroll and speed up things that they were doing anyway. We've got, you know, a new technology here with transformer neural networks and large language models, kind of generative AI. We've got something that looks like it can really help with exactly those tasks of summarizing a huge amount of information into something more manageable, and can help with expanding a simple set of instructions to cover a variety of special cases. It kind of feels like to me it would be a real shame if we got a technology like that and then used it to send more emails.
Yeah. And I'm not sure that we're having the right conversation about it, because it seems like the conversations continue to be around optimization, you know, for a single, for a single purpose.
Yeah, it's in many ways the kind of AI boosters aren't radical enough because they're kind of saying that we can optimize this, we can make this more efficient. Whereas really, it's not really a question of how the technology can help businesses and decision makers do what they're doing. It really ought to be more a question of how can we reorganize the kind of things we do around the new technology if we're going to take it seriously.
Yes. And something else to throw in here before we wrap up, but I continue to almost preach now about decision quality, right? So, but your book was quite illuminating for me, because I could say, oh, I can see what's happening here. So decision quality being, exercise judgment, make the best possible decision you can based on what you know. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you guarantee the outcome that you want, because there's it's like playing a hand of poker that you play the hand as best you can. You maximize the probability of winning the hand, but you won't win every hand, and that's an uncomfortable message for decision makers. Because they want to know that if I'm going to make a call, I want certainty that it's going to work. And if it's not going to work, I want plausible deniability that I was just told what to do, and I haven't made the decision. Someone else made it, and I'm just following orders. So.
No, absolutely. It is kind of horrible to be responsible for something when there's an element of luck involved. I think, organizations could do more to facilitate that kind of decision making. In general, just simply by recognizing important decisions as being things that need resources and budgets allocated to them, and kind of recognizing that when someone's making a decision, they need to be able to get themselves into an information environment where they can do all the things you say there, and where they can use that judgment. And also, I always feel like organizations undervalue optionality. There's a huge difference between something where you can change your mind and something where you can't change your mind. And somehow a lot of organizations just prefer to create situations in which it's more difficult to change your mind, where people are actually kind of tied to decisions and can't admit they're wrong. I mean, in particular, in my work, I kind of feel like the biggest difference between private and public sector, and what probably to my mind really accounts for, I would guess, all, or even controversially I might argue more than all, of the difference in efficiency between private sector and public sector organizations, is just simply that private sector organizations which have made a bad decision are much more likely to admit it and change their mind. If nothing else, because they start running into one of those financial constraints, which is one of the reasons why, it's the good side of all of the problems with debt and outside investment that we were talking about earlier. It does mean that sooner or later you run into something which makes you have to change your mind. The very best private sector organizations are always the ones in which it's possible, which maximize their ability to change their mind if it turns out that they've made a bad decision. The public sector, in my experience, is really, really averse to admitting it's made a mistake. And of course, because it's the government, it's much more difficult for it to face a hard external constraint that forces it to change its mind.
Fascinating. I feel like I could keep talking to you, but I want to be respectful of your time. We didn't even get into Milton Friedman. I wanted to, and economics and things like that. But,
no. I have made too many enemies by saying mean things about Milton Friedman.
Oh, really?
No, I mean, he was a great economist. He was wrong on almost every important issue.
Right.
Yeah.
Was there anything that you wanted to touch on that we didn't get a chance to cover?
Actually, the one thing that I really wanted to touch on, and I only mention it in passing, is if you want to get into this, look out Stafford Beer's CBC Massey lectures. They're entitled Designing Freedom. There's a book version which is much more reasonably priced than any of the kind of core cybernetics texts, and there's the online lectures. And that's how I started down this rabbit hole, and I hope that some people will follow me down it.
Yeah, I certainly will. So we'll talk about just before we we close where people can follow you and get the book and everything. But just actually, what's the do people talk about management cybernetics? I mean, is it making a comeback? Are there some critiques of it? Are there some advances? Are there is there some hope for a different way of thinking about management science?
I think there's some kind of hope because economists are, I think, getting more interested in general questions of control and general questions of manageability. There is still this horrible kind of social divide between economics faculties and business schools, which in my view is a shame because it means that the most influential policy economists never really deal with the kind of things that are dealt with in business schools. I feel like management cybernetics never goes away because it's always in the background, because the central problem of managing information and not being overwhelmed by it is always the problem that managers think about. It interests me, as actually a great book that I can't recommend highly enough, called Recoding America by Jen Palker, about her time as deputy CCO in the Obama administration.
Yeah.
Which it kind of suggests to me, like Fred Brooks's Mythical Man Month, like many of my conversations with Will Butler Adams at Brompton Bikes, that smart engineers, smart people with engineering training, left to themselves in management positions, will always reinvent about 30 to 40% of Stafford Beer's brain of the firm. And it always interests me to see which bits of it they end up reinventing.
Fascinating. Dan, this is great. Before we sign off, it'd be great if you could just share where people can follow you, your work. Obviously the book is available everywhere, but
the best place to keep up with me these days is my newsletter, which is called backofmind.substack.com. That's actually much better than social media for me these days.
Okay.
And that's where once or twice a week I kind of write about things in management, information, and decision making which occurred to me as interesting that week, usually from a sort of higher level, more theoretical point of view, because I'm more than 50 years old now. My thirst for getting involved in political arguments about the news of the day has just left me. I'm going to leave that to the young ones these days. So it's more theoretical. I hope it's a bit more quiet, mathematical, but that's where people can keep up with me.
Wonderful. I'll put those links in the show notes. Dan, this was great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, great. Really great to talk to you, Ben. Thank you very much.
Right. Bye for now.
Goodbye.